The Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971. The Dark Side of Human Nature. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains one of the most chilling and fascinating psychological studies in history. Conducted in 1971 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, this experiment aimed to explore the darker sides of human behavior and how individuals react to authority and power. Zimbardo's decision to carry out the study raised concerns about the profound impacts that social and environmental factors can have on human behavior, revealing unsettling truths about the potential for cruelty within everyone. The experiment was set in a simulated prison environment created in the basement of Stanford University. Participants were randomly assigned to one of two groups, one group as guards and the other as prisoners. The guards were given uniforms and sunglasses to symbolize authority, while the prisoners were dressed in smocks and shackled to represent subjugation. The guards were instructed to maintain control over the prisoners without resorting to physical violence, but they were free to exercise power in any other way. What started as a 2-week experiment quickly spiraled out of control. The guards began to manipulate and psychologically torment the prisoners, subjecting them to humiliation, dehumanization, and arbitrary punishment. As the days went by, the guards became increasingly sadistic, while the prisoners began to exhibit signs of psychological breakdown. Some prisoners became emotionally distraught, while others suffered from complete mental collapse. Within just a few days, the experiment had recreated the psychological and social dynamics of a real prison environment. Zimbardo and his team were unaware of how quickly the situation had deteriorated. It wasn't until Christina Maslach, a psychologist, visited the experiment and pointed out its ethical issues that Zimbardo realized the extent of the damage. This led to the abrupt termination of the study. Many of the participants, both guards and prisoners, experienced long-lasting psychological effects from the traumatic events. The Stanford Prison Experiment is often cited as a powerful example of how normal individuals, placed in positions of power and authority, can quickly engage in harmful and abusive behaviors. While the study provided valuable insight into the effects of social roles and power dynamics, it also raised serious ethical concerns. The experiment's findings challenged the belief that only inherently bad individuals are capable of committing evil acts, suggesting instead that situational factors and environmental pressures can cause ordinary people to behave in destructive ways. What makes it chilling? What makes the Stanford Prison Experiment so chilling is the stark reminder of how power and authority can easily corrupt human behavior. The rapid transformation of ordinary college students into oppressive figures illustrates the frightening reality that anyone can become cruel under the right circumstances. The study revealed the fragility of human nature and the malleability of moral behavior when subjected to social roles and expectations. In the aftermath, many participants, particularly those who played the role of prisoners, reported long-term psychological trauma, with some struggling to shake off the effects of their experience. This raised further ethical questions about the responsibilities of researchers in ensuring the well-being of participants and the moral implications of manipulating human behavior for scientific study. Ultimately, the Stanford Prison Experiment stands as a sobering reminder of the potential for cruelty within all individuals and the dangers of unchecked authority. It demonstrates the profound impact that social structures, roles, and power can have on our actions, and serves as a cautionary tale about the dark side of human nature. The Little Albert Experiment, 1920. The Conditioning of Fear. The Little Albert Experiment, conducted by psychologists John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner in 1920, is one of the most controversial and unsettling studies in the history of psychology. This experiment was designed to explore the concept of classical conditioning, the process by which emotions and behaviors can be conditioned through associative learning. However, it became infamous for its ethical implications and the profound psychological impact it had on the subject, a young child known as Little Albert. The experiment took place at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. The researchers wanted to demonstrate that fear could be conditioned in a human being, just as Pavlov had conditioned dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. To do so, they selected a 9-month-old infant, referred to as Little Albert, who had shown no signs of fear toward animals, including a white rat, which would be the central stimulus in the experiment. At the start of the experiment, Little Albert was shown the white rat, and he initially showed no fear. However, Watson and Rayner began to pair the presence of the rat with a loud, frightening sound, specifically, the sound of a steel bar being struck with a hammer behind Albert's head. The loud noise caused Little Albert to cry in fear. After several pairings of the rat with the frightening noise, Little Albert began to show signs of fear whenever he saw the rat, even without the accompanying loud noise. This demonstrated the core principle of classical conditioning. A neutral stimulus, the white rat, could become associated with an unconditioned stimulus, the loud noise, to create a conditioned response, fear. Little Albert had been conditioned to fear the rat, and this fear generalized to other similar stimuli. He became frightened of other furry objects, including a rabbit, a dog, and even a fur coat. The experiment showed that fear could be conditioned in a human being, just as Pavlov had conditioned salivation in dogs. Despite its groundbreaking contributions to the understanding of behaviorism, the Little Albert experiment is often criticized for its unethical nature. Little Albert, whose real name was later revealed to be Douglas Merritt, was subjected to psychological distress without the informed consent of his guardians, who were unaware of the full extent of the experiment. Additionally, the researchers did not attempt to decondition Albert's fear after the experiment, leaving him with an enduring fear of similar stimuli. The lasting psychological impact on the child is unknown, as no follow-up studies were conducted. The experiment also raised questions about the ethics of using vulnerable populations, such as infants, in psychological research. At the time, informed consent was not a requirement, and the long-term effects on the subject were not considered. Little Albert's participation in the experiment is widely regarded as a violation of ethical research practices, leading to significant changes in the way psychological experiments are conducted today. The Little Albert experiment reinforced the idea that human emotions, including fear, are learned responses rather than innate traits. This was a significant departure from the prevailing belief at the time that emotions were biologically determined. Watson's work contributed to the development of behaviorism, which emphasized the role of environmental factors in shaping human behavior, as opposed to the internal workings of the mind. The experiment also illustrated how emotional responses could be conditioned, not just simple reflexes like salivation, as shown in Pavlov's work. Though Watson and Rayner's experiment demonstrated the power of conditioning, it also highlighted the potential dangers of manipulating human emotions. The fact that Little Albert's fear was generalized to other stimuli, including animals, demonstrated the far-reaching effects that conditioning can have on an individual. This has important implications for understanding how fears, phobias, and other emotional responses can develop in real-life situations. While the Little Albert experiment remains a significant study in psychology, its legacy is complicated by its ethical violations. It played a crucial role in the development of behaviorism and our understanding of conditioning, but it also underscored the importance of ethical guidelines in psychological research. Today, research involving human participants must adhere to strict ethical standards, including informed consent and the protection of participants from harm. The story of Little Albert also serves as a reminder of the potential dangers of psychological manipulation, especially when it comes to vulnerable individuals. It is a chilling example of how human emotions can be shaped and altered through external influences, leaving lasting effects on a person's well-being. Obedience to authority, the Milgram experiment, 1961. The Milgram experiment, conducted by psychologist Stanley Milgram in 1961, is one of the most famous and controversial studies in the history of social psychology. The experiment was designed to investigate the extent to which individuals would obey an authority figure, even when instructed to perform actions that conflicted with their personal morals and ethical values. Milgram's work became a landmark study in understanding human behavior, authority, and the potential for individuals to engage in harmful actions under the influence of authority. Milgram's experiment was inspired by the events of World War II and the widespread compliance of individuals who followed orders from Nazi leaders, even when those orders led to atrocities. The central question Milgram sought to answer was whether ordinary people, when placed in a controlled experimental setting, would follow the orders of an authority figure to the point of harming another person. The experiment involved participants who were told they were taking part in a study on learning and memory. Each participant was assigned the role of the teacher, while an accomplice of Milgram, who was unaware of the true purpose of the experiment, played the role of the learner. The teacher's task was to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to the learner whenever they made a mistake on a memory task. In reality, the shocks were not real, but the teacher was unaware of this, believing the learner was actually being harmed. As the learner gave wrong answers, the teacher was instructed to increase the shock level, starting from 15 volts and rising in 15-volt increments up to a maximum of 450 volts, marked as XXX on the shock generator. As the shocks increased in intensity, the learner, who was actually an actor, began to scream in pain, plead for release, and eventually go silent. leading to the assumption that the learner had been severely harmed or even killed. Despite hearing these distressing reactions, many participants continued to administer shocks when urged by the authority figure, who was an experimenter dressed in a lab coat and giving orders to continue. The results of the Milgram experiment were shocking. Over 60% of the participants continued to administer shocks all the way to the highest voltage, even when they were visibly distressed and uncertain about what they were doing. Many participants showed signs of extreme anxiety, sweating, trembling, and nervous laughter, yet they followed the instructions of the experimenter without question. This obedience occurred despite the obvious harm the participants believed they were inflicting on the learner. Milgram's experiment revealed the power of authority and the potential for individuals to commit harmful acts when directed by a figure they perceived as legitimate. The findings highlighted the extent to which people are willing to obey authority figures, even when those figures are asking them to perform actions that conflict with their moral compass. The experiment raised important ethical questions about the role of authority in shaping behavior and the potential for individuals to become perpetrators of harm when placed in situations that demand obedience. One of the key implications of the Milgram experiment was its challenge to the belief that people who commit harmful acts, such as those involved in atrocities, are inherently evil or sadistic. Milgram's findings suggested that ordinary people, placed in certain social and psychological contexts, could be led to commit extreme acts of cruelty simply by following orders. This has important implications for understanding human behavior in settings such as the military, law enforcement, and even corporate environments, where individuals may be placed in situations where they are expected to follow authority, even when doing so goes against their personal values. However, the Milgram experiment is not without its criticisms. Ethical concerns have been raised about the psychological distress caused to participants, who were deceived into thinking they were causing harm to another person. The long-term effects on the participants were not properly studied, and some have argued that the experiment was unnecessarily cruel. Despite this, Milgram's study remains a powerful demonstration of the influence of authority on human behavior and has shaped subsequent research on obedience and conformity. Milgram's work continues to have a lasting impact on the field of psychology. It has led to the development of more stringent ethical guidelines for conducting experiments involving human participants, and it remains a fundamental study in understanding the dynamics of power, authority, and obedience. The experiment also serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the potential dangers of blind obedience and the need for individuals to question authority when it leads to harmful actions. The Milgram experiment remains a chilling reminder of the extent to which individuals are willing to go to obey authority figures, even when such obedience requires inflicting harm on others. It sheds light on the darker aspects of human nature and serves as a warning about the power of authority in shaping behavior and decision-making. The Monster Study, 1939. The Dark Side of Speech Therapy. The Monster Study, conducted in 1939 by psychologist Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa, is widely considered one of the most unethical and controversial studies in the history of psychology. The study, which aimed to explore the effects of positive and negative speech therapy on children, became infamous due to the harmful psychological impact it had on its young participants. The experiment is often cited as a chilling example of how scientific research can cross ethical boundaries and cause lasting harm to vulnerable individuals. The study's premise was simple. Johnson and Tudor sought to understand how different forms of speech therapy would affect children's speech development. The researchers divided a group of 22 orphan children into two groups. One group was given positive speech therapy, which involved praise and encouragement to speak clearly. The other group was subjected to negative speech therapy, in which they were harshly criticized for stuttering or even for their normal speech patterns. The children in the negative therapy group were told that they were stutterers and that their speech was abnormal and undesirable. They were frequently reprimanded, humiliated, and belittled for their speech, even when they spoke without any issues. The researchers believed that by using this negative reinforcement, they could cure any speech problems by instilling a sense of anxiety and fear in the children. The idea was that this fear would motivate them to overcome their supposed stuttering. However, the results of the study were deeply damaging. The children subjected to the negative therapy group suffered lasting psychological harm. Many of the children who were told they had speech defects and criticized for their speech development experienced a dramatic increase in speech problems, including stuttering and anxiety. Some of the children also showed signs of severe emotional distress, such as a diminished sense of self-worth and social withdrawal. The study caused lasting trauma for these vulnerable children, and it failed to meet the ethical standards of research. In contrast, the group that received positive speech therapy showed little to no improvement in their speech abilities. This outcome has led many to criticize the ethical validity of the experiment. While the study aimed to investigate speech development, it ultimately had disastrous consequences for the children involved, leading to the conclusion that the negative reinforcement had a far more profound and harmful impact than the researchers had anticipated. The monster study remained largely unknown until the 1980s when the details of the unethical experiment were uncovered. At the time of the study, research ethics were not as strictly regulated as they are today, and the welfare of participants, particularly children, was often overlooked in the pursuit of scientific advancement. The monster study served as a catalyst for change in research ethics, raising awareness of the need for stringent guidelines and protections for participants, especially those from vulnerable populations. One of the most troubling aspects of the study was the lack of informed consent. The children involved were orphans, and their guardians or caretakers were not fully informed about the nature of the experiment. The children did not understand what was happening and were not given a choice to opt out of the study. This disregard for consent and the lack of consideration for the well-being of the participants highlights the unethical nature of the study. The legacy of the monster study is one of cautionary tale, reminding us of the potential harm that can result from research that prioritizes scientific curiosity over the welfare of participants. The experiment's dark history has become a symbol of the dangers of psychological manipulation and the vulnerability of children in research settings. It also underscores the importance of ethical guidelines and scientific research to prevent the exploitation of vulnerable individuals for the sake of advancing knowledge. In the years following the revelation of the monster study, there has been increased attention to the ethical treatment of participants in psychological research. Today, research ethics are taken very seriously, and strict guidelines are in place to ensure that participants are fully informed, that their consent is obtained, and that they are protected from harm. While the monster study remains a tragic example of the ethical violations that can occur in psychological research, it also played a pivotal role in shaping the ethical standards that guide research today. LSD-VE Dinalery, MKUltra Projezi, 1953–1973. The MKUltra project, initiated by the CIA in 1953, is one of the most notorious and controversial covert experiments in the history of psychology and mind control research. The project involved a series of experiments that used drugs, including LSD, and other psychological techniques to explore the potential for controlling and altering human behavior. The project's ultimate goal was to find methods of mind control that could be used for military and intelligence purposes, but it also raised serious ethical and legal concerns due to the manipulation and harm inflicted on unsuspecting participants. The MKUltra project was born out of fears during the Cold War that the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea were developing mind control techniques to manipulate individuals. The CIA feared that these nations might use psychological tactics and drugs to turn people into unknowing spies or even assassins. To counter this perceived threat, the CIA sought to develop their own mind control methods, including experimenting with drugs that could alter the mind and influence behavior. One of the key substances used in MKUltra was LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, a powerful hallucinogenic drug. The CIA was particularly interested in LSD because of its ability to alter perception, memory, and consciousness, with the hope that it could be used to manipulate individuals' actions and thoughts. Over the course of the project, LSD was administered to hundreds of people, many of whom were not informed of the true nature of the experiments or their participation in them. The experiments were conducted in secret, and many of the subjects were unwittingly given LSD without their knowledge or consent. This included not only military personnel and CIA agents, but also civilians, including prostitutes, mental patients, and even prison inmates. In some cases, individuals were given large doses of LSD and other substances in an attempt to observe their effects on behavior and mental state, often leading to extreme psychological reactions such as anxiety, paranoia, and even long-term psychiatric issues. One of the most notorious aspects of MKUltra was the use of mind control techniques, including hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and electroshock therapy, in conjunction with LSD. The CIA sought to determine whether these techniques could be used to break down an individual's will and make them susceptible to manipulation. The project also explored the potential use of LSD in interrogations, with the hope that it might be used to extract information from unwilling subjects or to alter their memories. The MKUltra project was shrouded in secrecy for many years, and its existence was not made public until the 1970s. In 1973, following the Watergate scandal, the CIA attempted to destroy all documents related to MKUltra, but some were later recovered by investigators. These documents revealed the extent of the experiments and the unethical methods used to conduct them. The revelation of MKUltra caused public outrage and led to widespread criticism of the CIA and its involvement in human experimentation. The ethical implications of MKUltra were profound. The project violated basic principles of informed consent and human rights. Many of the individuals who were subjected to the experiments were unaware of what was happening to them, and many suffered lasting physical and psychological damage as a result. The CIA's actions also sparked debates about the role of government agencies in conducting secret experiments on citizens without their knowledge or consent. The MKUltra experiments have been linked to a number of long-term health problems in the individuals who were exposed to the drugs and techniques used in the project. Some participants experienced permanent psychological damage, including the development of mental illnesses, while others struggled with addiction and other lasting physical effects. In some cases, participants who were given LSD in high doses experienced severe breakdowns in their mental health, leading to hospitalization and long-term care. The legacy of MKUltra has continued to influence public perception of government secrecy, ethics in psychological research, and the use of drugs for manipulation. It has become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked government power and the potential for abuse in scientific experimentation. The project raised important questions about the ethics of human experimentation, the accountability of government agencies, and the protection of individuals' rights, especially when those individuals are vulnerable or powerless. In the aftermath of MKUltra's exposure, significant changes were made to research ethics. Legal and ethical frameworks were established to ensure that all psychological research involving human subjects is conducted with informed consent, transparency, and the protection of participants from harm. Despite the tragic nature of the MKUltra experiments, they led to reforms in the way scientific research is conducted, particularly in terms of the oversight and protection of vulnerable populations. Today, MKUltra remains a chilling reminder of the potential for abuse when power is unchecked, and it continues to be a subject of public interest and debate. The project serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of science, politics, and human rights, and it underscores the importance of ethical standards in psychological and medical research. The Bystander Effect Experiment, 1968. The bystander effect is the phenomenon where individuals are less likely to offer help in an emergency situation when other people are present. This psychological concept was discovered through a series of experiments conducted by social psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latane in 1968. These experiments revealed how the presence of others influences a person's likelihood to intervene in a crisis, showing that it's not only individual responsibility but also the social environment that shapes helping behavior. The origins of the bystander effect trace back to a horrifying murder case in New York in 1964. Kitty Genovese, a woman, was attacked and murdered outside her apartment. According to police reports, several neighbors heard the screams and even witnessed the assault, but none of them took action or called for help. This incident prompted Darley and Latane to study the psychological phenomenon that seemed to explain why people in groups were less likely to help someone in need. Darley and Latane designed a series of lab experiments to test this phenomenon. The main goal was to see how the likelihood of helping someone in distress changed when people were alone versus when they were surrounded by others. In one of their experiments, participants were connected to an intercom system and listened to a victim, an actor, calling out for help. Some participants were alone, while others were in a group setting. The results were exactly as the researchers had predicted. Participants who were alone were more likely to intervene and help in an emergency situation. However, when they were in a group, the likelihood of helping decreased significantly. The presence of others seemed to diminish individual responsibility. This is because individuals and groups tend to look to others for cues on how to behave, waiting for someone else to take the lead. If no one else acts, people are less likely to do so themselves. The bystander effect is rooted in several psychological principles. One key principle is diffusion of responsibility. According to this concept, when individuals are in a group, they feel less responsible for helping because they assume someone else will step in. Another principle at play is social influence, where people tend to rely on others' reactions to determine the appropriate behavior. If everyone else is passive or doesn't intervene, others may conclude that there is no need to help. Another important concept related to this effect is pluralistic ignorance. In such situations, individuals may think that others are not reacting because they don't perceive the situation as an emergency, leading to a lack of action. When people see that no one else is helping, they may assume that the situation is not serious, and as a result, nobody intervenes. The bystander effect experiments became a groundbreaking discovery in social psychology, shedding light on how individuals behave in group settings and their reluctance to take action in emergencies. These studies not only deepened our understanding of human behavior in social contexts, but also inspired further research into how social dynamics influence decisions to intervene in times of need. Understanding the bystander effect is crucial for improving responses to emergency situations and creating strategies that encourage individuals to take responsibility when witnessing an emergency. It also highlights the need for public education on the importance of acting quickly in critical situations, regardless of the number of people around. Ultimately, the bystander effect is more than just a psychological phenomenon. It has become a crucial area of study that continues to shape our understanding of social behavior. This experiment and its findings remind us of the power of social influence and the importance of promoting active intervention, not only in emergencies but also in everyday situations where people may need help. Skinner box, operant conditioning chamber. The Skinner box, also known as the operant conditioning chamber, is a tool used in behavioral psychology to study the effects of reinforcement and punishment on animal behavior. Developed by American psychologist B.F. Skinner in the 1930s, this device became a critical part of his research on operant conditioning, a type of learning in which behaviors are influenced by the consequences that follow them. The Skinner box was designed to be a controlled environment where animals, typically rats or pigeons, could engage in certain behaviors, such as pressing a lever or pecking a key, in exchange for a reward, such as food. The box was equipped with various devices, including levers, buttons, and dispensers for rewards, along with mechanisms for delivering aversive stimuli, such as electric shocks. The aim was to observe how the animal's behaviors changed based on the reinforcement or punishment they received. Skinner used this apparatus to demonstrate the principles of operant conditioning, which he categorized into different types of reinforcement and punishment. Positive reinforcement involves providing a reward to increase the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. Negative reinforcement involves removing an unpleasant stimulus to increase a behavior. On the other hand, punishment involves introducing an aversive stimulus or removing a rewarding stimulus to decrease a behavior. Through experiments with the Skinner box, Skinner was able to observe and measure the impact of different types of reinforcement on behavior. For example, when a rat pressed a lever and received food as a reward, the frequency of lever pressing increased, demonstrating positive reinforcement. Conversely, if the rat received an electric shock after pressing the lever, the behavior decreased, showing the effects of punishment. One of Skinner's most important contributions was the concept of shaping, a technique used to gradually reinforce closer approximations of a desired behavior. In the case of a rat, for instance, Skinner might begin by rewarding the rat for moving toward the lever, then gradually only reward it for pressing the lever, thus shaping the rat's behavior toward the desired response. The Skinner box also allowed Skinner to explore more complex behavioral patterns, such as intermittent reinforcement, where rewards are given at random or unpredictable intervals. This method, he discovered, leads to behaviors that are highly resistant to extinction, a concept that has been applied to understand habits and addictive behaviors in humans. Although the Skinner box was originally used to study animals, its principles of operant conditioning have been widely applied to human behavior as well. From teaching new skills to reinforcing desired behaviors in schools, workplaces, and therapy settings, Skinner's work has had a lasting impact on how behavior is understood and shaped. In conclusion, the Skinner box was a pioneering tool in psychological research that provided invaluable insights into how reinforcement and punishment influence behavior. Its legacy continues to influence contemporary psychology, particularly in the fields of learning, behavior modification, and applied behavior analysis.